They say the wealthiest homes are the safest places in America. Behind towering gates, private security, and walls lined with priceless paintings, people believe money can keep danger outside. But sometimes, the greatest threat is already sitting at the dinner table, smiling, raising a glass, and pretending everything is exactly as it should be. On a cold autumn evening, in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods outside Boston, a mansion filled with influential guests became the stage for an event that would leave one man dead, another missing, and an ordinary housekeeper caught in the middle of a secret that powerful people had spent years protecting. Those who attended that dinner would later tell investigators it all happened in a matter of seconds. One careless movement, one shattered bottle, one glance that was never supposed to happen. Yet when detectives reconstructed the night's events, they discovered the story hadn't started with the spilled wine. It had started years earlier, with promises, betrayals, and decisions made behind closed doors by people who believed their wealth placed them above consequences. The woman at the center of it all wasn't a journalist, a police officer, or a lawyer searching for corruption. She was simply a maid who arrived every morning before sunrise, quietly cleaned rooms that never truly belonged to her, and returned home each night believing she had survived another ordinary day. She had spent years making herself invisible because invisible people were rarely noticed, and unnoticed people usually stayed safe. That belief would be tested before the evening was over. Guests had traveled from across the country for what appeared to be an elegant private dinner hosted by one of the region's most admired businessmen. Luxury cars rolled through the gates one after another. Men in tailored suits exchanged confident handshakes. Crystal glasses reflected the glow of enormous chandeliers hanging above a dining room decorated with artwork worth millions of dollars. Every chair had been carefully arranged. Every place setting had been inspected. Every detail had been rehearsed so perfectly that even the household staff understood there was no room for mistakes. Yet the one mistake nobody planned for came from the quietest person in the house. As she reached across the polished table to serve a bottle of rare vintage wine, her hand slipped. The bottle struck the edge of a crystal glass before crashing across the table. Deep red wine spread over the white linen like a stain no one could erase. Conversation stopped instantly. Laughter vanished. Every eye turned toward the frightened maid, expecting to witness an angry millionaire scolding an employee for ruining a priceless bottle. Instead, something far stranger happened. The host's face drained of color. He ignored the shattered glass completely. He didn't look at the ruined tablecloth. He wasn't concerned about the expensive wine. His attention went somewhere else entirely. His eyes locked beneath the table as though something hidden there had suddenly been exposed. The room remained silent for several long seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, trying to understand why a man known for controlling every situation suddenly appeared terrified. Then he rushed toward the table, dropping to one knee and reaching underneath before anyone else could react. Most of the guests dismissed it as concern over damaged furniture. The servants lowered their heads and continued cleaning without asking questions. But the maid noticed something no one else seemed to notice. As the millionaire reached beneath the table, he quickly removed a small object wrapped tightly in waterproof tape and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. It happened so quickly that anyone blinking might have missed it. She wasn't supposed to see it. He wasn't supposed to realize she had. Their eyes met for only a brief moment, but that single glance carried more fear than any shouted warning ever could. From that instant forward, the evening changed in ways nobody present could have imagined. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened after that bottle shattered would raise a question investigators struggled to answer for months. What exactly had the maid seen beneath that table that was important enough for powerful people to risk everything to keep hidden? The shattered bottle lay across the polished dining table, its deep crimson stain spreading slowly through the white linen, while no one in the room dared to speak. For the guests, it looked like nothing more than an embarrassing accident. For the household staff, it was the kind of mistake that usually ended someone's career. But for Richard Caldwell, the billionaire host whose name carried influence from corporate boardrooms to political fundraisers across the country, it was something else entirely. The calm expression he had carefully maintained throughout the evening vanished in an instant, replaced by a look that even those closest to him had probably never witnessed before. It wasn't the expression of a man angry over an expensive bottle of wine. It was the expression of someone who had just watched years of carefully guarded secrets come dangerously close to being exposed. Standing only a few feet away, Emily Parker remained frozen with a towel in her trembling hands, replaying what she had just seen beneath the table over and over in her mind. She couldn't explain why Richard had reacted the way he did. She couldn't understand why a small object hidden under a dining table appeared to matter more than the distinguished guests surrounding him. But one thing had already become painfully clear. The dinner had stopped being ordinary long before the wine ever left the bottle. That raises the first question investigators would later ask again and again. Why would a simple accident terrify one of America's most respected businessmen? Richard Caldwell had built a reputation as someone who remained calm under impossible pressure. Financial crises, hostile business takeovers, public criticism, and multi-million-dollar negotiations had never shaken him in front of cameras or competitors. Newspapers described him as disciplined. Business magazines praised his composure. His employees often said they had never seen him lose control, no matter how difficult the situation became. Yet on this particular evening, in front of politicians, executives, investors, and longtime associates, a spilled bottle of wine broke that carefully constructed image within seconds. The expensive vintage could easily be replaced. The tablecloth could be cleaned. Broken crystal glasses could be purchased again. None of those things explained the fear that crossed Richard's face. It was almost as though he believed the wine hadn't ruined his dinner at all. It had uncovered something that should have remained hidden forever. Then there was the second mystery, one that would become even more difficult to explain. Less than an hour after the incident, the mansion's security system experienced what technicians would later describe as an unusual malfunction. Cameras covering the main dining room suddenly stopped recording. Hallway footage disappeared without warning. Several digital files that should have documented every movement inside the house during the evening were missing completely. Security companies spend enormous amounts of money designing backup systems specifically to prevent this kind of failure. Even if one camera stops working, another usually captures the same area from a different angle. Yet inside Richard Caldwell's mansion, multiple recordings vanished during the exact period investigators needed most. Some believed it was a technical error. Others suspected someone with intimate knowledge of the system had deliberately erased the footage. Whatever the explanation, one undeniable fact remained. The most important moments of the evening had somehow disappeared, leaving detectives with more questions than answers and forcing them to rely almost entirely on the memories of people who suddenly had very good reasons to protect themselves. The third question was perhaps the most unsettling of them all because it centered on someone almost everyone had overlooked. Emily Parker wasn't wealthy. She wasn't politically connected. She didn't own valuable information about billion-dollar corporations or government contracts. She was a hardworking housekeeper who had spent years quietly cleaning homes that most people would only ever see in magazines. She had no influence, no powerful friends, and no reason to become the focus of attention. So why, within hours of the dinner ending, did it seem as though influential people were suddenly watching her every move? Why did unfamiliar vehicles appear near her apartment? Why were members of the household instructed never to discuss what had happened that evening? And why did Emily begin receiving subtle warnings suggesting that forgetting what she had witnessed would be in her best interest? Those questions would become impossible to ignore as the days unfolded, because every answer investigators uncovered only revealed another layer of deception hiding beneath the polished surface of Richard Caldwell's carefully protected world. At first, the entire incident appeared destined to fade away like so many scandals involving the rich and powerful. The official explanation was simple, convenient, and easy for the public to accept. An unfortunate accident had interrupted an otherwise successful private dinner, nothing more. But the deeper investigators looked into Richard Caldwell's life, his guests, and the people employed inside his mansion, the more impossible that explanation became to believe. Every interview exposed another inconsistency. Every missing record pointed toward another unanswered question. Every witness seemed to know only part of the story, as though each person had been allowed to see only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. And waiting at the center of that puzzle was Emily Parker, the quiet maid whose accidental mistake had placed her in the path of secrets worth protecting at any cost. Before this story is over, you'll discover that what happened beneath that dining table was only the beginning, because the truth was far more shocking than anyone present could have imagined. Before anyone called her the woman who uncovered one of the country's most closely guarded secrets, Emily Parker was known for something much simpler. She was the housekeeper who always arrived first and left last. To the wealthy families who employed her, she blended into the background as naturally as the polished marble floors beneath their feet. They noticed when a room sparkled, when dinner was served perfectly, or when a guest complimented the spotless condition of their home, but very few ever noticed the woman responsible for making all of it happen. Emily preferred it that way. At 45 years old, she had learned that invisible people often heard the most and survived the longest. She wasn't interested in attention. She wasn't chasing recognition or praise. She simply wanted to earn an honest living, pay her bills on time, and care for the only family she had left. For nearly 20 years, she had worked inside some of the most expensive homes in Massachusetts, quietly moving through hallways decorated with artwork worth millions of dollars while carrying supplies that barely fit inside a worn canvas cleaning bag. Every mansion looked impressive from the outside, but Emily had learned long ago that beautiful houses often protected complicated lives. Her mornings began while most of the city was still asleep. Before sunrise, she would quietly leave the modest apartment she shared with her elderly mother, locking the door without making enough noise to wake her. The first bus arrived just after dawn, carrying nurses finishing overnight shifts, construction workers heading toward job sites, and people like Emily whose work began long before the executives they served had poured their first cup of coffee. During the ride, she rarely looked at her phone. Instead, she watched neighborhoods slowly come alive through the bus window, wondering what kind of day waited ahead. By the time she reached the affluent suburbs, everything seemed different. Streets were cleaner. Lawns were perfectly trimmed. Luxury vehicles lined long driveways protected by electronic gates. It was almost like stepping into another world, one where money erased everyday worries. Yet Emily knew that appearances could be misleading. She had spent enough years inside those homes to understand that expensive furniture couldn't hide broken relationships, and impressive reputations couldn't always conceal uncomfortable truths. Every task she performed reflected the same quiet discipline she had developed over decades. She polished hardwood floors until they reflected the morning sunlight like mirrors. She dusted shelves lined with rare books whose owners probably hadn't opened them in years. She carefully cleaned family photographs, wondering whether the smiling faces captured in those expensive frames still smiled when cameras weren't around. She arranged fresh flowers exactly as instructed, folded freshly pressed towels with practiced precision, and memorized the preferences of every household she served. Some homeowners liked fresh coffee waiting before they came downstairs. Others insisted every decorative pillow sit at exactly the right angle. Emily never complained. She believed there was dignity in doing even the smallest job well, regardless of whether anyone noticed. Ironically, her greatest strength became her greatest disguise. Because she worked so quietly and efficiently, people often forgot she was standing only a few feet away while they discussed business deals, family disputes, private phone calls, or financial matters they assumed no one else would ever hear. When her workday ended, Emily's responsibilities were far from over. Instead of returning home to rest, she stopped by the pharmacy to collect medication for her 72-year-old mother, whose health had steadily declined over the past several years. Doctors had warned that regular treatment and constant care were essential, and Emily never missed an appointment if she could help it. Much of what she earned disappeared almost immediately into medical bills, groceries, and rent, leaving very little for herself. Friends often encouraged her to find an easier career or move somewhere with lower expenses. But Emily couldn't imagine abandoning the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her after the unexpected loss of her husband many years earlier. She measured success differently from the wealthy people whose homes she cleaned. Success wasn't about luxury cars or vacation homes. It was making sure her mother never skipped a dose of medicine, that the refrigerator stayed full, and that another month passed without falling behind on rent. The people living in her neighborhood admired her for reasons completely unrelated to the mansions where she worked. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries carried upstairs, Emily was usually the first to volunteer. When a single mother across the hallway worked late, Emily quietly checked on the children until she returned home. During harsh winters, she helped shovel sidewalks without expecting payment or recognition. She never considered herself extraordinary. To her, kindness wasn't something reserved for special occasions. It was simply the right thing to do, especially in a world where too many people walked past those who needed help. Ironically, while billionaires trusted her with access to priceless possessions, the people who appreciated her most were those who had very little themselves. They saw the woman behind the uniform, not just the employee pushing a cleaning cart through hallways lined with marble and crystal. Richard Caldwell rarely looked at Emily for more than a few seconds at a time. Like many of his guests and business associates, he acknowledged her only when giving instructions or expecting something to be done. She wasn't insulted by it. After 20 years in domestic service, she had grown accustomed to becoming part of the furniture inside wealthy homes. Conversations paused when owners wanted privacy, then resumed as though she had completely disappeared. She heard names that regularly appeared on television. She recognized politicians before election commercials introduced them. She served meals to executives whose companies influenced millions of lives. Yet no one ever imagined the quiet housekeeper standing beside the dining table might remember every face, every conversation, and every unusual detail. They underestimated her because they believed ordinary people rarely paid attention. They couldn't have been more mistaken. Long before the dinner where the wine bottle shattered, Emily had noticed small moments inside Richard Caldwell's mansion that didn't seem to belong. Deliveries arriving well after midnight. Locked rooms that even senior staff were forbidden to enter. Guests who parked in the rear driveway instead of the front entrance. Security guards changing schedules without explanation whenever certain visitors arrived. At first, she convinced herself these were simply the routines of an extremely wealthy businessman whose life demanded privacy. After all, successful people often lived differently from everyone else. But as the months passed, those unusual moments became harder to dismiss. Each strange occurrence seemed unrelated on its own. Yet together they formed a pattern she couldn't ignore, even if she didn't fully understand it. She never spoke about what she noticed because experience had taught her that asking questions inside homes like Richard Caldwell's could end a career overnight. Still, one thought quietly stayed with her every time she left the mansion. This wasn't the first strange thing she'd noticed inside Richard Caldwell's mansion. Richard Caldwell's name carried enormous weight far beyond the gates of his estate. For more than 3 decades, newspapers celebrated him as the embodiment of the American dream. Born into an ordinary working-class family, Richard often shared the same story during television interviews. He spoke about delivering newspapers before school, working long hours through college, and risking everything to launch a small investment company with little more than determination and borrowed money. Whether every detail was true hardly mattered anymore. The public embraced the story because it represented something people wanted to believe, that discipline, sacrifice, and relentless ambition could still build an empire. By the time Emily Parker first accepted a housekeeping position at his mansion, Richard Caldwell's business interests stretched across real estate, technology, pharmaceuticals, and private investment firms worth billions of dollars. Financial magazines regularly ranked him among the country's most influential entrepreneurs. Cable news networks invited him to discuss the economy whenever markets became unstable. University graduates quoted his speeches during commencement ceremonies. To millions of Americans, Richard wasn't simply successful. He was proof that success itself was still possible. His reputation extended well beyond business. Every holiday season, cameras followed him as he donated millions of dollars to children's hospitals, veterans organizations, and disaster relief funds. His foundation sponsored scholarships for students from low-income families, restored historic libraries, and financed community health programs across several states. Local newspapers rarely missed an opportunity to publish photographs of Richard shaking hands with firefighters, teachers, or military veterans while presenting oversized donation checks. Politicians from both major parties eagerly appeared beside him during fundraising events because his endorsement carried enormous influence with donors and voters alike. Whenever disasters struck somewhere in the country, television viewers could almost predict Richard would soon appear on screen announcing another generous contribution. His carefully maintained image inspired admiration, and few people questioned whether his kindness was genuine. After all, what reason would anyone have to doubt a man who seemed determined to give so much back to society? Inside the mansion, however, admiration slowly gave way to uncertainty. Emily couldn't identify exactly when that feeling first appeared. There was no dramatic moment that suddenly transformed the estate into a place of suspicion. Instead, it happened gradually through dozens of small observations that seemed insignificant on their own, but impossible to ignore when viewed together. Unlike other luxury homes where she had worked for years, Richard Caldwell's residence operated according to unusually strict rules. New employees often arrived full of enthusiasm, impressed by the elegant surroundings and generous salaries. Yet few remained long enough to celebrate a work anniversary. Some resigned without explanation after only a few weeks. Others simply stopped appearing altogether, their names quietly removed from staff schedules as though they had never worked there. Whenever Emily asked fellow housekeepers whether anyone knew what happened to them, the responses were always the same: a brief shrug, a quick change of subject, then silence. The mansion itself reflected extraordinary wealth, but parts of it seemed almost untouched by daily life. Most rooms remained immaculate because they were cleaned constantly, yet several sections of the estate were permanently restricted. Elegant wooden doors remained locked day and night, even when Richard was traveling overseas. Certain hallways were monitored by additional security cameras that seemed excessive for a private residence. Maintenance workers were instructed never to enter specific areas unless personally escorted by senior security staff. Emily once watched electricians spend an entire afternoon repairing lighting fixtures while carefully avoiding one corridor they had been explicitly told not to approach. No explanation was ever offered, and none was expected. Inside Richard Caldwell's mansion, curiosity wasn't considered professionalism. It was viewed as a liability. Another rule surprised nearly everyone who joined the household staff. Personal phones were prohibited during working hours. At first glance, the policy sounded reasonable. Many high-profile families valued privacy, and preventing unauthorized photographs inside expensive homes wasn't uncommon. Yet Richard's policy went much further. Every employee surrendered their phone upon arrival and collected it only when leaving for the day. Even emergency calls were routed through supervisors instead of directly to staff members. Visitors faced similar restrictions, often placing their devices into secure lockers before entering certain areas of the property. Richard explained that these measures protected confidential business discussions from accidental recordings or security breaches. Most employees accepted the explanation because refusing the rules meant refusing one of the highest-paying housekeeping positions in the region. Emily accepted them as well, although she quietly wondered why a private residence required tighter security than many government buildings. Security personnel were impossible to ignore. They appeared professional, courteous, and remarkably observant, yet their responsibilities seemed to extend well beyond protecting the property. They watched deliveries arrive, monitored conversations among staff, and quietly documented visitors entering and leaving the estate. New employees quickly learned that almost every movement was noticed. Even simple routines, like taking a slightly longer lunch break or lingering too long in one hallway, occasionally prompted polite but pointed questions from supervisors. No one openly accused the staff of wrongdoing, but everyone understood they were being observed constantly. The atmosphere encouraged obedience rather than trust. Over time, Emily noticed many employees stopped speaking freely, even in break rooms reserved exclusively for household staff. Conversations became shorter. Opinions remained unspoken. It was easier to finish the day's work quietly than risk attracting unnecessary attention. Most unusual instruction of all involved questions. Staff manuals covered everything from cleaning procedures to emergency protocols, but one unwritten rule outweighed every other expectation. Servants were never to ask why. If furniture disappeared overnight, they simply adjusted the cleaning schedule. If unfamiliar guests arrived after midnight, they prepared refreshments without asking who they were. If security redirected them away from particular rooms, they immediately changed course. Supervisors reminded everyone that discretion formed the foundation of professional domestic service. Wealthy families valued loyalty above curiosity, and those unable to separate the two rarely remained employed for long. Emily understood the importance of respecting privacy. She had built her entire career around earning clients' trust. Yet something about Richard Caldwell's version of privacy felt fundamentally different. It wasn't simply protecting personal space. It felt as though the entire household revolved around preventing ordinary employees from seeing something they were never meant to discover. As the months passed, Emily became increasingly aware that every unusual rule pointed toward one place inside the mansion. Housekeepers cleaned guest suites, offices, dining rooms, libraries, wine cellars, and even indoor swimming areas according to meticulous schedules. Every corner of the estate received regular attention except one. Deep within the east wing stood a heavy walnut door that remained locked every hour of every day. Cleaning carts rolled past it without stopping. Dust never seemed to collect around its entrance despite no one ever being assigned to maintain it. Even senior household managers avoided discussing the room whenever new employees asked about floor plans or maintenance assignments. Eventually, curiosity faded because everyone accepted the same simple reality. There was one room nobody ever cleaned. The evening that would change, everything began long before the first guest stepped through the front doors of Richard Caldwell's mansion. Emily Parker noticed it the moment she arrived for work that morning. The estate, usually calm and methodical, carried an unusual sense of urgency that spread quietly through every hallway. Housekeepers were instructed to polish surfaces that had already been cleaned the previous day. Fresh floral arrangements arrived before sunrise, replacing displays that were barely 48 hours old. The dining room was rearranged twice before breakfast, with each chair measured carefully to ensure perfect spacing around the enormous handcrafted oak table. Even the silverware received a final inspection under bright lighting before being placed beside imported porcelain plates. Every member of the household staff understood they were preparing for an important evening, yet no one had been told exactly why. Richard Caldwell had hosted countless dinners over the years for governors, celebrities, foreign diplomats, and business leaders, but this gathering felt different from the very beginning. The smallest mistakes were corrected immediately. Supervisors spoke in unusually hushed voices, and even veteran employees admitted they had never seen preparations handled with such extraordinary precision. Emily had grown accustomed to serving influential guests, but as luxury vehicles began arriving through the estate's front gates shortly after sunset, she realized this dinner was unlike any she had witnessed before. The first arrival was Senator Thomas Whitmore, a veteran lawmaker whose face regularly appeared on national television discussing economic policy and government oversight. He greeted Richard warmly, though Emily couldn't help noticing that neither man smiled for very long before lowering their voices and moving toward Richard's private study. Less than 10 minutes later, another black sedan rolled quietly into the circular driveway. From it stepped federal Judge Harold Bennett, a respected figure whose courtroom decisions had shaped several high-profile corporate cases over the past decade. Richard welcomed him with the same carefully rehearsed hospitality, yet the atmosphere remained strangely restrained. Instead of relaxed conversation, their exchange seemed measured, almost cautious, as though every word had been chosen long before either man arrived at the mansion. More guests followed in rapid succession. Among them was Dr. Michael Graves, the chief executive of one of the country's fastest-growing pharmaceutical companies. Publicly, he was celebrated as an innovator responsible for groundbreaking medical research and charitable healthcare initiatives. Business magazines praised his leadership, while television interviews presented him as a visionary committed to improving lives through scientific advancement. Yet as Emily quietly refilled water glasses and adjusted place settings, she noticed Dr. Graves repeatedly scanning the room instead of engaging comfortably with the other guests. He checked his watch so often that even members of the serving staff exchanged discreet glances. Every few minutes, another guest arrived carrying a polished smile that disappeared almost immediately after entering the mansion. The conversations remained polite, but something beneath the surface felt unusually restrained. People laughed when expected, yet the laughter never sounded genuine. Compliments were exchanged, but no one appeared truly relaxed. It felt less like a celebration and more like a gathering where every person carried information they were unwilling to share. Then came the final arrival, and unlike everyone before him, no announcement accompanied his entrance. The vehicle itself drew little attention. It lacked diplomatic flags or government plates, appearing almost intentionally ordinary despite being escorted through the estate's security gates without delay. Emily happened to be arranging crystal glasses near the dining room entrance when she noticed several members of Richard Caldwell's security team quietly reposition themselves. Their movements were subtle enough to escape most guests' attention, yet unmistakable to someone who had spent years observing the routines of the household. The passenger stepped from the vehicle wearing a dark overcoat with the collar raised high around his face. Before Emily could catch a clear glimpse, two security officers guided him through a side entrance instead of the main foyer. Throughout the evening, she saw him only briefly from a distance. He never joined the other guests for cocktails. He never introduced himself. Whenever conversations paused, he remained standing near the edge of the room, careful to stay beyond the brightest lights. Several guests acknowledged his presence with brief nods, but no one spoke his name aloud. Even among people accustomed to guarding confidential information, this man seemed determined to remain invisible. Richard Caldwell's behavior grew increasingly unusual as the evening progressed. Normally confident and composed, he appeared distracted despite making every effort to hide it. Emily noticed him checking the antique grandfather clock in the hallway repeatedly, then glancing toward his wristwatch moments later, as though measuring every passing minute against an unseen schedule. He excused himself from conversations more frequently than usual, disappearing briefly into his office before returning with the same carefully controlled expression. Once, while speaking with Senator Whitmore, Richard stopped mid-sentence after hearing the faint vibration of a phone inside his jacket. He stepped away immediately, answered in little more than a whisper, then returned several minutes later without offering an explanation. Whatever message he received seemed to deepen the tension already hanging over the mansion. His guests noticed it as well, though none appeared willing to ask what had happened. Meanwhile, the mansion's kitchen operated with military precision. Executive chef Daniel Mercer, who had prepared meals for presidents, celebrities, and members of foreign royal families, rarely allowed anyone to interfere once dinner service began. Yet on this evening, Richard entered the kitchen personally less than 15 minutes before the first course was scheduled to leave the pass. Emily had never witnessed that before. Their conversation remained quiet enough that most staff members couldn't hear every word, but fragments carried across the room. Richard instructed the chef to delay one course by exactly 12 minutes. Another dish was removed from the menu entirely without explanation. A particular bottle from the private wine cellar was requested personally by Richard himself, despite Chef Mercer recommending a different vintage that paired more naturally with the evening's menu. The chef hesitated only briefly before nodding in agreement. Whatever Richard wanted, no one intended to challenge his decision. Emily carefully retrieved the bottle from the temperature-controlled cellar beneath the mansion. It rested alone inside a locked display cabinet, separated from the rest of Richard Caldwell's already extraordinary collection. She recognized the label immediately because senior staff had often spoken about it with admiration. The bottle wasn't simply rare. Collectors considered it nearly impossible to replace, having been produced decades earlier from a vineyard whose oldest vines no longer existed. Its estimated value exceeded what Emily earned in several years of honest work. Holding it carefully with both hands, she couldn't understand why Richard had selected such an extraordinary vintage for what appeared, at least publicly, to be an ordinary private dinner among respected colleagues. Wealthy clients often served expensive wine, but something about this particular bottle seemed unusually significant. Richard personally watched as it was uncorked. He inspected the label one final time before instructing Emily to serve it herself once every guest had taken their seat. As the final preparations fell into place, Emily noticed something that unsettled her even more than the unusual behavior of the guests. Throughout the evening, no one had raised a toast. There were no birthday wishes, no business announcement, no charitable milestone, and no family celebration. The atmosphere lacked every reason people normally opened bottles of such extraordinary value. Everyone present appeared focused on something else entirely, something far more important than enjoying an elegant dinner together. Emily carried the bottle toward the dining room, unaware that within minutes it would slip from her hands and begin a chain of events none of them could ever stop. Looking back later, investigators would reach one unsettling conclusion that changed the entire meaning of that evening. The expensive wine wasn't chosen for celebration. Emily Parker had served hundreds of formal dinners during her 20 years as a housekeeper. She understood the rhythm of an elegant evening so well that she could almost predict each movement before it happened. Wait until the host lifted his glass. Step forward from the left. Pour slowly without allowing the bottle to touch the rim. Move clockwise around the table. Never interrupt a conversation. Never make eye contact longer than necessary. Never become part of the evening. A great housekeeper, she often believed, was remembered only when something went wrong. That night, she silently repeated those familiar rules in her mind as she carried the rare bottle through the dining room. The conversations around the table had grown noticeably quieter. Senator Thomas Whitmore leaned toward Judge Harold Bennett as though discussing something that demanded absolute privacy. Dr. Michael Graves sat unusually still, his fingers resting against the stem of his empty wine glass while he stared at the polished surface of the table. The mysterious guest who had entered through the side entrance remained seated near the far end, his face partially hidden beneath the soft shadows cast by the chandelier. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the table, watching every movement with an intensity Emily had never seen before. It almost felt as though he wasn't waiting for dinner to begin. He was waiting for something else entirely. Emily carefully removed the bottle from its silver cradle and approached the first guest. The rich aroma of the vintage wine drifted gently into the room as she poured with steady hands, filling each crystal glass to exactly the same level. Years of experience had taught her that confidence came from routine, and routine left little room for mistakes. One by one, the glasses filled until she reached the final section of the table where Richard Caldwell sat speaking quietly with the unidentified guest. For a brief moment, everything appeared perfectly ordinary again. The expensive china gleamed beneath the chandelier. Crystal reflected warm golden light across the tablecloth. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers somewhere inside the mansion. Anyone walking into the room at that precise second would have believed they were witnessing nothing more than another exclusive dinner attended by some of the country's most successful people. No one could have imagined that history was about to change because of one accidental movement, lasting less than 2 seconds. As Emily extended the bottle toward Richard Caldwell's glass, someone unexpectedly shifted in their chair. Whether it was carelessness, distraction, or something else entirely would become a subject of endless speculation afterward. Judge Harold Bennett turned abruptly to respond to Senator Whitmore, and his elbow struck Emily's forearm with just enough force to break her balance. She instinctively tightened her grip, but the smooth glass bottle slipped from her fingers before she could recover. Time itself seemed to slow. The bottle struck the edge of the polished oak table with a sharp crack before bouncing across the white linen. Crystal glasses shattered as deep red wine exploded across the expensive tablecloth, flowing rapidly between silver cutlery and porcelain plates before dripping onto the Persian rug beneath. Several guests pushed back their chairs instinctively while others gasped in surprise. Emily stood frozen in disbelief, her heart pounding so violently she could barely hear the sound of breaking glass. After 20 years without a serious mistake, the one accident she had always feared had finally happened. Her first instinct was to apologize. She opened her mouth, preparing to explain that it had been an accident, but the words never came. Something far more astonishing unfolded before her eyes. Richard Caldwell didn't even glance at the shattered bottle lying across the floor. He ignored the ruined tablecloth, the priceless wine soaking into imported fabric, and the fragments of crystals scattered around his guests. Instead, his expression changed completely. The confidence that had defined him for decades disappeared almost instantly. His face lost its color, and his eyes darted toward the underside of the dining table with unmistakable urgency. Without saying a single word, he pushed his chair backwards so violently that it toppled onto the marble floor behind him. Then, to the complete confusion of everyone present, Richard dropped to one knee and reached beneath the table as though searching desperately for something only he knew existed. The room fell silent once again, but this silence carried a different weight. It wasn't embarrassment. It was confusion mixed with growing fear. Emily remained exactly where she stood, still clutching the empty neck of the broken bottle. From her position beside Richard Caldwell, she could see beneath the table more clearly than anyone else. As Richard reached into the shadows beneath the polished oak surface, his hand closed around a small black object secured with strips of waterproof tape. He tore it free in one swift motion and slipped it into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket with remarkable speed. To anyone seated around the table, his movement probably looked like an attempt to rescue something from the spilled wine. But Emily saw the object clearly before it disappeared. It was a compact flash drive, carefully hidden where no ordinary guest would ever think to look. For one brief second, Richard Caldwell believed no one had noticed. Then he looked up. Their eyes met. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. Yet in that single glance, Emily understood something she couldn't fully explain. Richard Caldwell wasn't worried about losing expensive wine. He wasn't protecting antique furniture or valuable artwork. He was protecting whatever information was stored on that tiny flash drive. More importantly, he now realized that one person inside the mansion had witnessed him retrieving it. Emily immediately lowered her eyes, pretending to focus on the broken glass scattered across the floor, hoping he might believe she hadn't understood what she had seen. But it was already too late. Richard's expression hardened in a way she had never witnessed before. The warm public smile seen on magazine covers and television interviews disappeared completely, replaced by the cold calculation of a man rapidly reconsidering every person in the room. Without speaking, he slipped the flash drive deeper into his jacket and slowly stood back up, smoothing his suit as though nothing unusual had happened. His guests exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for him to explain the bizarre reaction they had just witnessed. Instead, Richard calmly apologized for the interruption and instructed the staff to continue serving dinner. The conversation resumed, but only on the surface. Beneath the polite exchanges and carefully measured laughter, something fundamental had changed. Senator Thomas Whitmore stopped discussing legislation and began watching Richard more closely. Judge Harold Bennett quietly adjusted his seat while studying the faces around the table. Dr. Michael Graves appeared increasingly uncomfortable, taking only small sips from his wine without speaking. Even the mysterious guest who had remained silent throughout most of the evening slowly lifted his head toward Emily, his eyes lingering on her just long enough to make her feel deeply uneasy. She could no longer shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible line simply by witnessing something she had never been meant to see. No one accused her of anything. No one raised their voice. Yet the atmosphere inside the mansion transformed so completely that it became impossible to ignore. Every smile now seemed forced. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every glance carried questions nobody dared ask aloud. Emily knelt to gather the broken crystal from the floor, forcing herself to remain calm despite the growing unease settling in her chest. She tried convincing herself that perhaps the flash drive contained harmless business records or confidential financial documents. Wealthy executives protected sensitive information every day. There had to be a reasonable explanation for Richard Caldwell's behavior. But the harder she tried to dismiss what she had witnessed, the more one detail refused to leave her mind. A man with Richard's influence would never tape an ordinary flash drive beneath his dining table during an important private dinner. Whatever it contained was valuable enough to hide in plain sight, yet dangerous enough that he couldn't risk anyone else finding it. As Emily carefully placed the last fragments of broken crystal onto her serving tray, she noticed something happening near the mansion's entrance. Without drawing attention to themselves, two members of Richard Caldwell's security team quietly approached the front doors. A moment later, another guard moved toward the rear hallway leading to the gardens. Their movements were calm, deliberate, and almost impossible to notice unless someone happened to be watching them closely. Within minutes, every major exit from the mansion had been secured. Someone quietly locked every exit. No one announced that the dinner should continue. It simply did, almost as though every person seated around the table had silently agreed to pretend the last few minutes had never happened. Emily Parker had witnessed wealthy families recover gracefully from awkward moments before, but this felt entirely different. The conversations resumed, yet they carried none of the warmth or confidence that had filled the room earlier that evening. Senator Thomas Whitmore attempted to restart a discussion about economic policy, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Harold Bennett nodded politely without offering much in return, his attention drifting repeatedly toward Richard Caldwell. Dr. Michael Graves pushed a perfectly prepared piece of steak across his plate without taking a single bite. Even the mysterious guest sitting near the end of the table remained motionless, his face still concealed beneath the soft shadows of the chandelier. It was as though every person present had suddenly become aware that the evening no longer revolved around an elegant dinner. It revolved around something none of them dared acknowledge. Emily quietly replaced the ruined tablecloth with the help of another member of the household staff, carefully avoiding eye contact with the guests. Years of experience had taught her that domestic employees were expected to disappear emotionally as much as physically. Their role was to restore order without becoming part of the story. Yet despite her best efforts to blend into the background, she could feel eyes following her every movement. Each time she approached the table with fresh serving dishes, the conversation seemed to pause for a fraction of a second before continuing again. The silence between sentences lasted longer than it should have. Simple exchanges felt rehearsed, as though everyone present was carefully measuring every word before speaking. Even the clinking of silverware sounded unusually loud against the heavy stillness filling the room. Emily noticed something else that unsettled her even more. Plates that should have been nearly empty remained almost untouched. Chef Daniel Mercer and his kitchen staff had spent the entire day preparing an extraordinary meal, yet hardly anyone appeared interested in eating it. Richard Caldwell remained composed on the surface, but Emily could now recognize subtle changes in his behavior that would have escaped almost anyone else. His public smile returned whenever someone looked directly at him, yet it vanished the instant their attention shifted elsewhere. He continued making polite conversation, occasionally laughing at comments that were only mildly amusing, but there was no sincerity behind it. Every few moments his eyes drifted toward the inside pocket of his jacket, where the flash drive now rested. He checked it almost instinctively, pressing his hand lightly against the fabric as though reassuring himself it was still there. Once or twice, Emily even noticed him studying the room itself instead of the people inside it, carefully scanning windows, doorways, and hallways with quiet precision. It wasn't the behavior of a relaxed host enjoying an evening among trusted friends. It was the behavior of someone expecting an interruption. Then Richard leaned slightly toward the head of his private security detail, a broad-shouldered man named Daniel Cross, who had spent years protecting corporate executives before joining Richard's personal staff. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, spoken quietly enough that no guest appeared to notice. Emily happened to be standing close enough while collecting empty bread plates to hear only 2 words spoken clearly. "Watch her." Richard never looked directly at Emily while giving the instruction. He didn't have to. Daniel Cross followed Richard's brief glance before giving the slightest nod in return. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, no obvious confrontation. Yet Emily suddenly felt the uncomfortable certainty that the instruction could only have referred to one person. She, the quiet housekeeper who had accidentally spilled the wine. The woman who had seen Richard retrieve the hidden flash drive. Emily tried convincing herself she was imagining it. Perhaps the security team had been instructed to monitor the entire household, because important political figures were present. That explanation seemed far more reasonable than believing Richard Caldwell considered her a threat. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. After the main course concluded, Emily carried several serving dishes back toward the kitchen. The familiar hallway connecting the dining room to the service entrance had always been one of the quietest parts of the mansion, but tonight it felt strangely different. As she turned the corner, she caught a brief reflection in a decorative mirror hanging opposite the staircase. 2 security guards had entered the hallway behind her. They weren't rushing. They weren't speaking. They simply maintained a measured distance as she continued walking. Emily told herself they were probably heading toward another part of the mansion. She continued into the kitchen, helped organize trays for dessert service, and waited several minutes before returning toward the dining room. When she stepped back into the hallway, the same 2 guards were still there. Neither of them said a word. Neither appeared interested in anyone else. Whenever Emily changed direction, they adjusted their positions without making it obvious. If she paused near a storage cabinet, one of them casually stopped near a window while the other examined a framed painting on the wall. Their movements were subtle enough to avoid alarming the guests, yet deliberate enough that Emily couldn't dismiss them as coincidence anymore. For the first time since accepting employment at Richard Caldwell's estate, she felt less like an employee and more like someone being quietly monitored. Her heartbeat quickened as she returned to the dining room carrying fresh coffee cups. She reminded herself to remain calm. Drawing attention to her growing anxiety would only make matters worse. Yet every instinct told her something had shifted after the wine spill. Earlier that evening she had been invisible, another trusted member of the household staff, moving unnoticed between wealthy guests. Now that invisibility had disappeared completely. Every entrance seemed occupied by security personnel. Every hallway suddenly felt narrower than before. Even the mansion itself, once familiar after years of employment, now seemed strangely unfamiliar, as though the walls were slowly closing around her. Emily glanced toward the grand front entrance while pretending to straighten a decorative centerpiece. Daniel Cross stood nearby speaking quietly into a small earpiece. Another guard remained positioned beside the rear doors leading toward the gardens. A third watched the staircase connecting the main floor to Richard Caldwell's private office. It was impossible not to notice that security personnel had quietly spread throughout the mansion in positions that limited movement without attracting attention. Guests continued their conversations, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the change unfolding around them. Emily realized something that sent a chill through her. If she wanted to leave, she wasn't entirely certain anyone would allow her to. She thought briefly about asking permission to go home early, claiming she felt unwell. The idea disappeared almost as quickly as it came. What explanation could she possibly offer? That she felt uncomfortable because her employer had hidden a flash drive beneath his dining table. That security guard seemed unusually interested in her movements. None of it sounded believable, even inside her own thoughts. So she did what she had always done whenever life became uncertain. She continued working quietly, hoping the evening would end before anything else happened. But the mansion had not finished revealing its secrets. Just as Chef Daniel Mercer instructed the staff to prepare dessert service, every chandelier above the dining room flickered once. Then twice. The conversation stopped. The lights dimmed for a fraction of a second before returning. Several guests looked upward. Richard Caldwell slowly rose from his chair. And without the slightest warning, the lights suddenly went out. The darkness arrived so suddenly that it almost felt intentional. 1 second, crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the dining room, illuminating polished silverware, expensive artwork, and the uneasy faces gathered around Richard Caldwell's table. The next, everything disappeared. Every light inside the mansion went out at once. Swallowing the room in complete blackness, the gentle music stopped mid-note. The quiet hum of the air conditioning vanished. For the first time that evening, no one cared about appearances. Someone inhaled sharply. A chair scraped across the marble floor. Crystal glasses rattled as startled hands reached instinctively for the edge of the table. Emily Parker froze where she stood, still holding a silver coffee tray against her chest. Her eyes searched desperately for shapes inside the darkness, but there was nothing to see. 20 years of working inside luxury homes had taught her how to remain calm during emergencies, yet this felt different. This wasn't simply a power outage. The silence that followed carried the unmistakable feeling that someone had been waiting for the lights to disappear. No one spoke for the first several seconds. Then voices emerged one after another from different parts of the room. Senator Thomas Whitmore asked whether the backup generator had failed. Judge Harold Bennett calmly instructed everyone to remain where they were until the lights returned. Dr. Michael Graves muttered something Emily couldn't understand before his chair shifted suddenly across the floor. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a glass shattered, sending tiny fragments scattering across the marble. Richard Caldwell's voice finally broke through the confusion. It sounded steady, almost rehearsed, as though he had prepared himself for exactly this moment. He assured everyone that there was no reason for concern and insisted the generator would restore power within moments. Emily found that strangely comforting for only a brief instant. Then she realized something else. If Richard sounded so calm, how could he possibly know this blackout was temporary? The question settled quietly in the back of her mind as the darkness continued stretching far longer than any ordinary electrical failure should have lasted. Those 30 seconds seemed endless. Without sight, every sound became sharper. Emily heard measured footsteps somewhere behind the dining table, moving with purpose rather than confusion. They didn't resemble the uncertain movements of frightened dinner guests trying to find their way through the dark. Whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. Another sound followed almost immediately. It was soft enough that most people would never have noticed it, yet Emily recognized it because she had heard it countless times while working inside the mansion. A heavy door opened somewhere beyond the dining room. Just as quickly, it closed again. Then everything became still once more. Richard Caldwell didn't call out. Daniel Cross and the other security guards remained unusually quiet. No one shouted instructions or attempted to reassure the guests. The silence itself became unsettling, making Emily wonder whether everyone else in the room sensed the same thing she did. This darkness wasn't creating confusion. It was creating opportunity. Then, almost as suddenly as it had vanished, the electricity returned. The chandeliers burst back to life overhead, flooding the dining room with warm light. Conversation stopped immediately as everyone blinked against the sudden brightness. Emily lowered the tray she had been clutching so tightly that her hands ached. Around the table, guests instinctively looked toward one another, silently confirming everyone was safe. For a brief second, relief spread through the room. Then someone noticed an empty chair. The chair belonged to the unidentified guest, who had arrived through the side entrance earlier that evening. His place setting remained exactly as it had before the blackout. His untouched dinner rested neatly on the table. His wine glass stood half full beside his plate. Even the folded linen napkins still lay across the arm of his chair. Yet the man himself had vanished without a trace. A heavy silence settled over the dining room once again. Senator Thomas Whitmore slowly turned toward Richard Caldwell. Judge Harold Bennett frowned as he glanced around the room, clearly trying to understand how someone could disappear during half a minute of darkness without anyone noticing. Dr. Michael Graves looked noticeably paler than before, avoiding eye contact with the others while absent-mindedly straightening his cufflinks. Emily carefully scanned every doorway leading away from the dining room. None appeared forced open. None showed signs of unusual activity. It simply looked as though one person had ceased to exist. Richard Caldwell reacted almost immediately. He smiled. It wasn't a broad smile, nor one that reached his eyes, but it was enough to break the growing tension before anyone else could speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "please don't let a minor inconvenience ruin our evening. One of our guests had to leave unexpectedly because of an urgent personal matter. Everything is perfectly fine." The explanation hung in the air, without convincing anyone. Emily watched the faces around the table carefully. Senator Whitmore looked as though he wanted to ask another question, but thought better of it. Judge Bennett remained silent, though the uncertainty on his face was impossible to hide. Dr. Graves finally lifted his wine glass for the first time all evening, yet his hand trembled slightly as he took a sip. The mysterious guest's departure should have been impossible to ignore. No one had heard a chair move during the blackout. No one remembered a door opening after the lights returned. Most importantly, no one had seen him leave. Richard continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. He thanked everyone for their patience, complimented Chef Daniel Mercer on the excellent meal, and suggested dessert be served without further delay. His confidence gradually encouraged polite conversation to resume, at least on the surface. But beneath the carefully exchanged smiles and courteous remarks, uncertainty lingered around the table. Every person present now understood that something had happened during those 30 seconds of darkness. Whether they admitted it aloud or not, they all knew Richard Caldwell's explanation left far too many questions unanswered. Emily tried to focus on her work, collecting empty dishes while the guests forced themselves back into conversation. Yet her instincts refused to quiet. She replayed the blackout repeatedly in her mind, the footsteps, the opening door, the impossible disappearance. Richard's strangely prepared response. None of it made sense. During her years inside the mansion, she had learned to trust her instincts whenever something felt out of place. They had rarely failed her before, and they weren't failing her now. Whatever had happened during those missing 30 seconds, Richard Caldwell knew far more than he was willing to admit. As she carried several serving plates toward the kitchen, Emily noticed something unusual near the service corridor leading away from the dining room. At first, she thought it was another stain left behind by the spilled wine earlier that evening. She took another step closer, lowering the stack of plates slightly as the overhead lights reflected against the polished marble floor. Her heart stopped. It wasn't wine. She discovers blood. Emily Parker stood perfectly still, balancing the stack of dinner plates in her hands as she stared at the dark crimson drops scattered across the polished marble floor. Her first instinct was to convince herself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps one of the guests had cut a finger on the shattered crystal during the blackout. Perhaps someone had accidentally spilled another glass of wine while returning to their seat. But the closer she looked, the more obvious the truth became. This wasn't wine. Wine spread unevenly across smooth marble, leaving broad stains that reflected the light. These drops were thicker, darker, and spaced apart in a way that suggested movement. They formed a faint trail leading away from the dining room toward the restricted east wing of Richard Caldwell's mansion. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She glanced back toward the dining room where laughter had awkwardly returned, almost as if everyone had silently agreed to ignore the strange events of the evening. Richard Caldwell was once again entertaining his guests with practiced confidence, his calm demeanor giving no hint that anything unusual had happened. If he already knew about the blood, he certainly wasn't showing it. Emily quietly set the plates on a nearby serving cart, picked up a fresh cleaning cloth, and began following the trail before anyone else noticed it. The farther she walked, the quieter the mansion became. The sounds of polite conversation faded behind thick walls lined with expensive artwork and antique lighting fixtures. Every few feet, another small drop appeared on the marble floor before disappearing briefly around a corner. Emily hesitated several times, reminding herself that it wasn't her responsibility to investigate anything. She was a housekeeper, not a detective. If someone had been injured, security would surely handle the situation. Yet another thought kept returning. If the blood belonged to the mysterious guest who had vanished during the blackout, then Richard Caldwell's explanation about an urgent personal matter couldn't possibly be true. She slowed her pace as the trail ended near a narrow service hallway rarely used during formal dinners. There, resting against the base of an ornate wooden cabinet, she noticed something glinting beneath the overhead lights. At first it looked like an ordinary piece of jewelry. When she bent down to pick it up, she realized it was a single silver cufflink engraved with the initials HB. Emily immediately recognized the initials. Earlier that evening, she had helped Judge Harold Bennett with his coat after he arrived at the mansion. She distinctly remembered admiring the elegant pair of custom-made silver cufflinks he wore because they matched the initials embroidered inside his jacket. Yet now one of them lay abandoned beside a trail of blood in a hallway where none of the guests should have been walking. She carefully turned the cufflink over in her hand. A tiny scratch ran across its polished surface, as though it had been torn away during a struggle rather than removed intentionally. For a moment, she considered returning it to Judge Bennett, assuming he had simply lost it during the confusion. But something about its location made that explanation impossible to believe. Emily slipped the cufflink into the small apron pocket where she usually kept spare buttons and sewing pins, intending only to keep it safe until she understood what had happened. Before returning to the dining room, another faint smell caught her attention. It wasn't the rich aroma of roasted meat or expensive wine drifting from the kitchen. It was something sharper: burned paper. The scent seemed completely out of place inside a carefully maintained mansion where every room was climate-controlled and fireplaces remained unused during formal dinners. Emily followed the smell toward a small utility room normally reserved for cleaning supplies. The door stood slightly open. Inside, a decorative metal wastebasket still released thin curls of smoke. Someone had attempted to burn a collection of papers only moments earlier, yet the fire had died before consuming everything completely. Emily glanced over her shoulder to ensure the hallway remained empty before kneeling beside the wastebasket. Several pages had been reduced to blackened fragments, but others remained partially intact around the edges. She carefully lifted one piece using the corner of her cleaning cloth. Although much of the page had burned away, several words remained clearly visible. She could read Richard Caldwell's name near the top beside the logo of one of his investment companies. Lower on the page appeared a series of financial figures followed by account numbers she didn't recognize. Another fragment contained the words confidential agreement, while a third referenced an overseas banking institution. Emily wasn't trained in finance, but she immediately understood one thing. Whoever had burned these papers hadn't wanted them destroyed eventually. They had wanted them destroyed immediately, yet they had been interrupted before the flames could finish the job. As Emily gently placed the burned pages back into the wastebasket, something else beneath the ashes reflected the overhead light. Reaching carefully through the charred paper, she pulled out a smartphone with a cracked screen. The device was still warm, suggesting it had been hidden only minutes earlier. It wasn't one issued to the household staff. Richard Caldwell prohibited employees from carrying phones during work hours, and every staff member surrendered their devices before entering the mansion each morning. This phone belonged to someone else. Emily pressed the power button instinctively. The screen flickered once before illuminating. It hadn't been damaged beyond use. A lock screen appeared almost immediately. The wallpaper displayed nothing but a dark background, yet one notification remained visible across the top of the screen. One missed call. The contact name wasn't saved. Only a number. Emily stared at it for several seconds before another notification quietly appeared beneath the first. Message deleted. Her heart raced. Someone had remotely erased information from the device while it sat in her hands. She quickly locked the screen again, uncertain whether touching it any further might somehow make things worse. Every discovery she had made over the past few minutes seemed connected. The blood, Judge Harold Bennett's missing cufflink, the partially burned financial documents, the abandoned phone. None of it resembled coincidence anymore. Together they formed pieces of a story she couldn't yet understand. Emily slipped the phone carefully into the deep pocket of her cleaning apron beside the cufflink. She knew she shouldn't take it. She also knew leaving it behind meant someone else would almost certainly destroy it before morning. Her only intention was to find an opportunity to turn everything over to the authorities once she safely left the mansion. Taking one final look around the utility room, she quietly stepped back into the hallway and closed the door behind her. She had taken only a few steps toward the kitchen when a strange feeling settled over her. It was the unmistakable sensation that someone was standing nearby. She stopped walking. The hallway remained silent. No footsteps. No voices. Only the faint hum of the restored electrical system. Slowly, Emily turned her head toward a decorative mirror hanging opposite the corridor. In its reflection, just beyond the corner she had rounded moments earlier, stood Daniel Cross, Richard Caldwell's head of security. He wasn't speaking into his earpiece. He wasn't patrolling the mansion. He was standing perfectly still, watching her. Their eyes met briefly through the mirror before Daniel looked away as though nothing unusual had happened. Emily forced herself to keep walking at the same steady pace, resisting every instinct to run. But deep inside, she understood something that sent a chill through her entire body. They knew she had found something. Emily Parker forced herself to keep moving, even though every instinct told her to stop and think. Her hands remained steady as she pushed the silver serving cart down the hallway, but inside, her thoughts were racing faster than they ever had before. During 20 years of working inside luxurious estates, she had encountered family arguments, corporate disputes, celebrity scandals, and enough private secrets to fill entire books. Her employers trusted her because she understood an unwritten rule of the profession. What happened inside the house stayed inside the house. That principle had earned her an excellent reputation and opened doors to some of the most exclusive homes in New England. But what she had uncovered tonight no longer felt like an ordinary family secret. Blood didn't simply appear on polished marble floors. Important legal documents weren't burned halfway unless someone had been interrupted. Judges didn't casually lose engraved cufflinks in restricted hallways, and anonymous cell phones didn't receive remote deletions minutes after being discovered. Each clue pointed toward something larger, something carefully hidden beneath the polished image Richard Caldwell had spent decades building. Emily didn't know the full story yet, but she knew enough to understand that leaving the mansion quietly had suddenly become far more important than finishing her shift. She returned to the kitchen where Chef Daniel Mercer and the remaining staff were preparing coffee and dessert trays for the guests. The atmosphere there had changed as well. Earlier in the evening, cooks had joked with one another while putting final touches on elaborate desserts. Now hardly anyone spoke. Several employees avoided eye contact altogether, concentrating on their assigned tasks with unusual intensity. Emily wondered whether they had noticed the strange events unfolding throughout the mansion, or whether years of experience had taught them not to notice anything at all. She carefully placed the serving cart beside the sink and slipped one hand into her apron pocket, reassuring herself that the broken cufflink and the abandoned phone were still there. She immediately pulled her hand away before anyone could observe the movement. If Daniel Cross had truly been watching her in the hallway, there was every chance someone else inside the mansion was doing the same. Trying to appear completely ordinary, Emily lifted a tray of coffee cups and returned toward the dining room. The guests remained seated, but the atmosphere had grown noticeably colder. Senator Thomas Whitmore stared silently into his untouched coffee instead of participating in conversation. Judge Harold Bennett occasionally glanced toward the empty chair once occupied by the unidentified guest, almost as though expecting him to return at any moment. Dr. Michael Graves looked exhausted, repeatedly loosening the knot of his tie before tightening it again. Richard Caldwell continued speaking with confidence, yet Emily noticed his attention drifting toward the doors every few moments. He no longer appeared concerned about entertaining his guests. He appeared to be waiting for confirmation that something had gone according to plan. As Emily poured coffee into Judge Harold Bennett's cup, something immediately caught her attention. His left shirt cuff remained fastened neatly beneath his tailored jacket sleeve. His right cuff, however, had been folded back awkwardly and secured with a temporary safety pin provided by someone inside the household. Judge Bennett noticed Emily looking toward his sleeve and instinctively lowered his arm beneath the table. He offered an uncomfortable smile before quietly thanking her for the coffee. Neither of them mentioned the missing cufflink. Emily simply nodded and moved on to the next guest, but the brief exchange confirmed what she had already suspected. The silver cufflink hidden inside her apron belonged to him. The question was no longer whose cufflink it was. The question was how it had ended up beside a trail of blood leading toward the restricted East Wing. When dessert concluded, guests slowly began leaving the dining room in small groups rather than all at once. Some gathered near the fireplace for private conversations, while others stepped onto the terrace overlooking the gardens. Richard Caldwell remained remarkably attentive, personally thanking each guest for attending before quietly speaking with Daniel Cross near the entrance hall. Emily used the opportunity to begin clearing the dining table. Broken glass had already been removed, fresh linens replaced the stained cloth, and expensive china was carefully stacked for transport back to the kitchen. On the surface, the room looked almost identical to how it had before the wine bottle shattered. Anyone arriving now would never imagine that only an hour earlier panic had spread across the mansion. Yet Emily couldn't ignore the feeling that the evidence she had discovered represented only a small fraction of whatever had actually happened during the blackout. While collecting the final serving tray, she noticed another detail hidden beneath one of the dining chairs. It was a folded sheet of paper partially tucked beneath the carved wooden leg, almost invisible against the polished floor. She crouched naturally, pretending to retrieve a dropped dessert spoon before carefully sliding the paper into her hand. The top corner had been burned, matching the partially destroyed documents she had already found inside the utility room. Most of the writing had become impossible to read, but one section remained untouched by the flames. It listed several dates followed by initials and large financial amounts. Near the bottom appeared a single handwritten sentence that immediately caught Emily's attention. "Destroy after tonight." She stared at the words for only a moment before quietly folding the paper and placing it inside the same apron pocket, holding the phone and Judge Harold Bennett's cufflink. Whoever had attempted to destroy these records had missed at least one page. Emily now carried far more evidence than she ever intended to possess. She glanced toward the front entrance. Most of the guests appeared ready to leave, and relief briefly washed over her. If they were departing, her own shift couldn't be far from ending. She imagined stepping onto the evening bus, returning home to check on her mother, and contacting the authorities first thing in the morning. That simple plan gave her enough confidence to continue working. She finished wiping the last section of the dining table before quietly removing her apron and folding it over one arm, careful not to disturb the hidden items inside its pocket. Just as she reached the staff hallway leading toward the employee exit, Daniel Cross stepped into view. He wasn't alone. 2 additional security guards stood several feet behind him. Daniel smiled politely, though there was no warmth in his expression. "Emily," he said calmly, "Mr. Caldwell would like a word with you before you leave." The hallway suddenly felt much narrower than before. Emily looked briefly toward the employee exit only a few yards away. One of the guards slowly closed the door. The click of the lock echoed through the empty corridor. At that moment, Emily realized something that made her pulse race. This wasn't a request. Richard Caldwell already knew she had been somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. And judging by the way Daniel Cross and the guards watched her every movement, they knew she had found something. Emily Parker's heartbeat quickened, but years of experience taught her that fear was easiest to hide behind routine. She offered Daniel Cross the same polite smile she gave every supervisor and quietly nodded. "Of course," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Daniel stepped aside and motioned for her to follow him, but instead of leading her toward Richard Caldwell's private office as she expected, he stopped halfway down the corridor. Richard himself emerged from the library, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored jacket as though the evening had unfolded exactly as planned. The flash drive Emily had seen beneath the dining table was still tucked safely inside his coat. His expression had returned to the calm confidence that made television audiences admire him. If someone had walked into the mansion at that exact moment, they would have seen nothing more than a gracious billionaire thanking his staff after another successful gathering. Richard complimented Emily for handling the earlier accident with professionalism and assured her no one blamed her for the spilled wine. He even apologized for the unexpected power outage, explaining that electricians would inspect the estate first thing in the morning. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. It sounded perfectly ordinary. Yet throughout the exchange, Daniel Cross never looked away from Emily, and neither did the 2 security guards standing quietly at the end of the hallway. Richard finally smiled and told her she was free to leave for the evening. Emily thanked him politely, but as she walked toward the employee entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that his kindness had been carefully rehearsed. It sounded less like gratitude and more like a final opportunity to see whether she would reveal anything about what she had discovered. Outside, the cool night air should have brought relief, yet it only sharpened her growing anxiety. The estate that usually looked magnificent beneath carefully placed landscape lighting now felt strangely unwelcoming. Emily boarded her usual evening bus, choosing a seat near the back where she could quietly gather her thoughts. Every stop along the route felt longer than usual. She slipped one hand inside her handbag, reassuring herself that Judge Harold Bennett's cufflink, the partially burned document, and the abandoned phone were still safely hidden beneath a folded sweater. She considered calling the police immediately, but every explanation sounded impossible. How could she convince officers that a billionaire had hidden a flash drive beneath his dining table, that an unidentified guest had vanished during a blackout, and that she had discovered blood leading toward a restricted hallway? Without proof, it would sound like the imagination of a frightened employee after an exhausting evening. She decided to wait until morning, organize everything she had found, and then report it properly. It seemed like the safest decision she could make. By the time she reached her apartment, she had almost convinced herself that she still controlled the situation. The following morning shattered that belief. Emily woke early, prepared breakfast for her mother, and turned on the television while organizing medication beside the kitchen table. Every local news station carried the same story. Reporters stood outside Richard Caldwell's mansion, describing an unfortunate incident involving a temporary electrical failure during a private charity dinner. According to official statements, one guest had experienced a minor medical emergency, unrelated to the power outage, and had been driven home by personal staff before emergency responders were needed. Authorities confirmed there was no criminal investigation and praised Richard Caldwell for handling the situation calmly while ensuring the safety of everyone present. The story lasted less than 3 minutes before moving on to weather forecasts and stock market updates. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. There was no mention of the missing guest, no mention of blood, no mention of disappearing security footage. It was as though the most disturbing moments of the evening had never happened at all. Determined to make sense of what she had witnessed, Emily removed the cracked phone from her handbag and attempted to power it on again. This time the screen remained completely black. She tried charging it for several minutes, but nothing happened. Whatever information it once contained had either been erased remotely or permanently disabled overnight. Frustrated, she unfolded the partially burned document once more. Before she could examine it carefully, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed the housekeeping supervisor from Richard Caldwell's estate. Expecting to discuss another work schedule, Emily answered immediately. Instead, the supervisor spoke in an unusually formal tone. Effective immediately, all household staff scheduled to work during the previous evening's dinner had been placed on indefinite leave, while the mansion underwent what was described as a routine security review. No timeline was provided. No explanation was offered. Before Emily could ask questions, the call ended. Something about the announcement didn't make sense. Richard Caldwell relied heavily on experienced employees. Closing an entire household operation without warning would create enormous logistical problems unless something far more important was happening behind the scenes. Emily decided to contact a coworker named Lisa Morgan, one of the servers who had worked beside her during the dinner. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried another employee, then another. None answered. By midday, she had attempted to reach 7 members of the household staff. Every number either went unanswered or had suddenly been disconnected. It was as though the people she had worked alongside for years had vanished overnight. Emily searched social media, hoping someone had posted an explanation, but every profile connected to the estate had either disappeared or stopped updating entirely. The silence felt deliberate. That afternoon, she finally visited the local police station, carrying the cufflink and the burned document inside a sealed envelope. She carefully explained everything she had witnessed, choosing her words cautiously so she wouldn't sound unbelievable. The officer listened patiently before excusing himself to speak with a supervisor. When he returned, his tone had changed noticeably. He thanked Emily for coming forward, but explained that officers had already reviewed the events at Richard Caldwell's residence. According to their findings, there was no evidence of foul play. The temporary power outage had caused unnecessary confusion, and one guest had simply left early due to a private health matter. As for the blood she claimed to have seen, investigators believed it likely resulted from minor cuts caused by broken crystal during the wine spill. The officer politely returned the envelope containing the cufflink and burned document without opening it. Emily left the station with the uncomfortable realization that someone had already shaped the official version of events long before she arrived. Over the next several days, newspapers and television programs repeated the same carefully worded account. Headlines praised Richard Caldwell's professionalism during an unexpected electrical malfunction. Business commentators applauded his decision to continue supporting charitable causes despite the unfortunate interruption. One magazine even published photographs from earlier in the evening showing smiling guests arriving beneath the mansion's grand entrance. None mentioned the unidentified guest who had disappeared. None questioned why security footage from key areas of the estate had reportedly become unavailable because of what technicians called a system corruption that occurred during the blackout. Every version of the story matched perfectly, almost as though every newsroom had received the exact same explanation from the exact same source. Emily tried convincing herself to let it go. She had done everything an honest citizen should do. She had spoken to the police. She had preserved the evidence she found. She had told the truth. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she remembered Richard Caldwell reaching beneath the dining table to retrieve the hidden flash drive. She remembered the trail of blood, the abandoned phone, and Daniel Cross watching her through the mirror. The story wasn't over. Someone had simply buried it beneath carefully prepared statements and influential connections. Late that evening, as Emily prepared to turn off the lights inside her apartment, her own phone vibrated quietly on the kitchen table. There was no caller identification. No saved contact. Only a single text message. "I know what you saw." Emily read the words again, her hands trembling slightly as another notification appeared beneath the first. "Meet me tomorrow." The message kept Emily Parker awake for most of the night. She read it so many times that the words almost lost their meaning, yet the feeling they left behind only grew stronger. "I know what you saw." Whoever had sent it knew about the wine spill. They knew about Richard Caldwell's hidden flash drive. More importantly, they knew Emily had witnessed something no one else was supposed to see. She considered deleting the message and pretending it had never arrived. She considered going back to the police despite the way her first visit had ended. She even thought about leaving town for a few days until everything settled down. But each option led back to the same unanswered question. Who had disappeared during those 30 seconds of darkness? And why had so many powerful people worked so quickly to erase every trace of what happened? By sunrise, Emily made a decision she never imagined herself making. She would meet the anonymous sender, but she would do so cautiously. She wrote the address of the meeting place on a piece of paper and left it hidden inside a kitchen drawer beside her mother's medication, hoping someone would eventually find it if she failed to return. The meeting location couldn't have been more ordinary. It was a small public park overlooking the harbor where retired couples fed pigeons and joggers passed by without paying attention to strangers sitting on weathered benches. Emily arrived 20 minutes early, scanning every passing face while trying not to attract attention. Nearly half an hour passed before an elderly man wearing a faded navy jacket slowly approached her. He carried no briefcase, no phone, and no visible sign that he belonged in the dangerous world Emily had unexpectedly entered. He stopped several feet away before quietly asking, "You're Emily Parker, aren't you?" She nodded cautiously. The man introduced himself as Walter Hayes. His voice was calm, almost tired, carrying the weight of someone who had spent years living with memories he could no longer ignore. Walter explained that he had once served as the senior accountant for one of Richard Caldwell's earliest investment companies. For nearly 25 years, he managed financial records, audited corporate transactions, and quietly solved accounting problems no one else inside the organization could understand. He had retired 5 years earlier, but retirement, he admitted, hadn't freed him from the things he had learned while working for Richard Caldwell. Emily listened, without interrupting, as Walter revealed why he had finally decided to contact her. He had watched the news coverage following the dinner and immediately recognized that the official story didn't match the truth. More importantly, he had learned through former colleagues that Richard Caldwell's security team had spent the following morning collecting surveillance servers, employee records, visitor logs, and backup storage devices from the mansion. Walter understood exactly what that meant because he had seen similar operations before. Whenever sensitive information threatened Richard's empire, evidence disappeared long before investigators knew where to look. Walter leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Emily," he said quietly, "Richard Caldwell isn't covering this up to protect himself." Emily frowned, confused by the statement. Walter shook his head slowly. "If this were only about Richard, the problem would have been solved years ago. He's protecting every powerful person who sat around that table with him that night." The words settled heavily between them. Emily thought back to the dinner guests one by one. Senator Thomas Whitmore, Judge Harold Bennett, Dr. Michael Graves, the unidentified man who disappeared during the blackout. They came from different professions, different backgrounds, and different parts of the country. On the surface, they had almost nothing in common except their connection to Richard Caldwell. Walter explained that appearances had always been part of Richard's greatest strength. The dinner wasn't simply a social gathering. It was a meeting between individuals whose fortunes, reputations, and futures had quietly become connected over many years. Some controlled enormous financial institutions. Others influenced legislation, legal decisions, or billion-dollar government contracts. Publicly, they often appeared unrelated. Privately, they depended upon one another in ways the public could never imagine. Richard wasn't the leader of the group. He was the man trusted to keep its secrets. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had haunted her since the wine bottle slipped from her hands. "The flash drive," she whispered. Walter looked around the park before answering. "That drive contains records stretching back almost 2 decades. His expression grew noticeably heavier. Not ordinary business records, real records, payments that never appeared on official balance sheets, secret agreements signed under different company names. Offshore transfers designed to hide where money actually went, bribes disguised as consulting fees, contracts awarded before bids were ever opened. Every transaction carefully layered so investigators would never see the complete picture. Emily struggled to process everything she was hearing. She had expected financial fraud or tax evasion. Walter's explanation reached much further than that. It described a network built patiently over years, protected by wealth, influence, and absolute silence. Walter continued carefully, choosing every word with obvious caution. He explained that the flash drive documented how influential people exchanged favors that could never appear in official records. Judges received support through hidden financial channels. Politicians benefited from donors whose identities remained concealed through shell companies. Corporate executives secured government contracts after private agreements were reached long before public announcements. Whenever someone became a threat to the organization, pressure followed in different forms. Careers ended unexpectedly. Businesses collapsed after mysterious financial investigations. Witnesses withdrew statements. Whistleblowers suddenly changed their minds. According to Walter, the system rarely relied on direct violence because influence alone usually achieved the desired result. But on rare occasions, he admitted quietly, people who refused to cooperate simply disappeared from public life under circumstances that were never fully explained. Official investigations reached convenient conclusions, while those who asked too many questions found themselves isolated until they eventually stopped asking altogether. Emily remembered the blood on the marble floor and the unidentified guest who vanished during the blackout. A cold feeling settled over her. Walter noticed the change in her expression before speaking again. "You weren't supposed to see Richard retrieve that drive," he said. "The wine spill forced him to act before everything was ready." Emily finally understood why Richard Caldwell had ignored the shattered bottle, why Daniel Cross had watched her so closely afterward, and why the official story had been prepared almost immediately. The flash drive wasn't valuable because it contained evidence against one powerful man. It threatened an entire network of influential people whose reputations depended upon those files remaining hidden forever. If its contents became public, careers would collapse, corporations would face investigations, and political figures who had spent decades building public trust could lose everything almost overnight. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded an old photograph. It showed Richard Caldwell standing beside several familiar faces at a charity event nearly 15 years earlier. Senator Thomas Whitmore smiled toward the cameras. Judge Harold Bennett stood only a few feet away. Dr. Michael Graves appeared near the back of the group. Even younger, they were already connected long before the dinner Emily had witnessed. Walter quietly pointed toward another face standing near Richard that Emily immediately recognized. It was the unidentified guest who had disappeared during the blackout. "His name is Anthony Mercer," Walter said softly. "He helped build the financial structure that kept everything hidden. If he disappeared that night, then something went terribly wrong." Emily stared at the photograph, realizing that every answer only created more questions. She looked back toward Walter, preparing to ask where the flash drive was now. Before she could speak, Walter answered the question himself. He shook his head slowly. "Richard Caldwell retrieved it from beneath the table," he said. "Everyone believes he still has it." Walter paused. His expression changed. "That's the problem." He looked directly into Emily's eyes. "Someone else already has the drive." Walter Hayes' final sentence echoed in Emily Parker's mind long after the conversation ended. She searched his face, hoping he would explain how that could possibly be true. She had watched Richard Caldwell tear the flash drive from beneath the dining table with her own eyes. She had seen him slip it into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket before standing up and calmly resuming dinner. There had been no opportunity for anyone to take it. Walter slowly folded the old photograph and returned it to his jacket. "Richard believes he has the original drive," he said quietly. "The people sitting around that table believe he has it too, but what they don't know is that someone copied every file months before that dinner ever took place." Emily felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to shift. If Walter was telling the truth, then the dinner hadn't been about protecting information from outsiders. It had been about discovering who inside their own trusted circle had betrayed them. The spilled wine hadn't started the crisis. It had simply forced it into the open before anyone was ready. Before Emily could ask another question, Walter glanced toward the entrance of the park. His expression changed instantly. "Don't turn around," he said softly. "Just listen." Emily kept her eyes fixed on the harbor while her heart began racing again. Walter continued speaking in a calm voice that barely moved above a whisper. "Dark SUV, parked across the street. 2 men pretending to read a newspaper. They've been watching us since I arrived." Emily resisted every instinct to look. Walter stood slowly from the bench as though their conversation had ended naturally. "You can't trust anyone connected to that mansion," he warned. "Not even the people you think you know." Without another word, he walked calmly toward the opposite side of the park, disappearing into the afternoon crowd before Emily could stop him. She remained seated for another minute, forcing herself to appear relaxed before finally standing and walking toward the nearest bus stop. As she boarded the bus, she glanced briefly through the window. The black SUV remained exactly where Walter had described. It didn't move until the bus pulled away from the curb. The ride home felt longer than usual. Emily replayed every conversation she had ever had with her coworkers inside Richard Caldwell's mansion. She remembered small comments that hadn't seemed important at the time. Questions about her personal life. Casual conversations about where she lived. Friendly reminders to clock in and out at certain times. She had always believed those conversations reflected ordinary workplace friendships. Now she wasn't so sure. When she finally reached her apartment building, she noticed someone standing outside the entrance waiting beside the mailboxes. It was Lisa Morgan, one of the housekeepers Emily had worked beside for nearly 6 years. Emily's face brightened with relief. "Lisa," she called, hurrying toward her. "I've been trying to reach you for days." Lisa smiled warmly, just as she always had. "I know," she replied. "I've been busy." There was something different about her voice. It sounded measured, carefully controlled. Emily unlocked the apartment building's front door, inviting Lisa inside. Once they reached the hallway leading toward the elevators, Emily lowered her voice. "Something terrible happened at the mansion," she whispered. "I don't know who else I can trust." Lisa remained unusually quiet. Then she asked a question that immediately made Emily's stomach tighten. What exactly did you find after the blackout? Emily stopped walking. She hadn't mentioned finding anything. Not to Lisa. Not to anyone except Walter Hayes. Trying to remain calm, Emily answered carefully. What do you mean? Lisa sighed softly, almost as though she had grown tired of pretending. The blood, she said. The cufflink. The burned papers. The phone. Emily felt the color drain from her face. She had never told Lisa about any of those discoveries. Not one. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Lisa looked down at the floor before quietly saying words Emily never imagined she would hear. I'm sorry. Emily stared at her closest coworker in complete disbelief. Lisa continued speaking before Emily could respond. Richard Caldwell trusted me long before you started working there. Every word landed harder than the one before it. I wasn't hired to clean the mansion. I was hired to watch the people who cleaned it. Emily struggled to breathe. 6 years. 6 years of shared lunch breaks. Birthday cards. Holiday gifts. Conversations during long workdays. Lisa had comforted her after difficult days, asked about her mother's health, celebrated work anniversaries, and listened whenever life became overwhelming. None of it had been genuine. I reported everything, Lisa admitted quietly. Who arrived late? Who asked questions? Who spent too much time near restricted areas? And after the dinner, she looked directly into Emily's eyes. I told Daniel Cross you found something. Emily took one slow step backward. Her mind raced.